Welcome students to week 5, where we're focusing on immigration policy. So first of all, I want to do what I've done before with you all, which is I want to frame it a little bit because of course you have lots of data. So I want to see if I can help you frame that data. There are basically 4 key policy questions that any kind of comprehensive immigration proposal needs to answer. Or at least we would hope that any comprehensive proposal would answer. The first question, of course, is who do we let into the country? So that's where we have to look at contributions versus costs. We also need to look at our national values. Our response, for example, to refugees is not a response that is rooted in the question of contributions versus costs. It's the question of whether or not we want to be the kind of country that welcomes refugees. So it's a question of national values. And then, of course, who do we let in on a temporary basis? Who do we let in on a permanent basis? Secondly, we have to ask how we enforce our immigration policy. So what do we do around our borders? What do we also do around our current residents? Either residents that have come over under a broken system or residents that have overstayed their visas. Third, we need to look at the question of employers. Are we going to sanction employers in any way who employ people that are here undocumented or partially documented? Because, of course, if you actually sanction employers, it takes away one of the reasons why people come. Do we want to detain people in detention facilities? Will they be public facilities or private facilities? Or do we want to release them with electronic monitoring and ankle bracelets? And then, of course, is an immigration violation an issue of civil law or criminal law? Ironically, one of the reasons why immigrants have so few protections under our system and so few rights is because we don't see it as a criminal issue, we see it as a civil issue. Of course, lastly, under enforcement is the question of what we think is an appropriate punishment. You know, I think of what Juan Martinez used to say, and I just realized, I don't know if I said this to you before, so I apologize if I'm saying it again, but he used to say, what's an appropriate punishment for someone who breaks into your house, who builds your deck, who paints your house, who takes care of your garden, who takes care of your children, who cleans your house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's an appropriate punishment for that person? In addition to the question of who we let in and how we enforce policy, we need to ask, how do we integrate immigrants? So what kind of sponsorship requirements do we create? Do we prioritize family policy so that people who enter already have family networks that support them and that help them to integrate? And what do we do around language? Are we going to be a country like Canada with more than one language? Or how much English are we going to require? Lastly, the question that is hardly ever dealt with in immigration policy, but really needs to be, is how do foreign policy and immigration intersect? So as we do our trade policies, are we going to look at how those impact immigration? Are we going to look at issues of security, international security and stability? As Massey talks about, are we going to look at collaborative relationships, like the relationship that we have with Mexico and Canada, which we used to look at before 1965, and then we haven't looked at since then. So these are the key policy categories that I want you to look at, and I want you to look at in your assignment, also in your second paper. So now the other thing I want to do with you is I want to go over the last comprehensive immigration proposal that we had, which was a bipartisan proposal in 2013. I want to move this down so you can see the name. It was called the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act of 2013. It was drafted by what was called the Gang of Eight, 4 Republican congresspeople and 4 Democratic congresspeople. So it was fully bipartisan. It did pass the U.S. Senate, but it was not brought to the floor of the House for a vote. So what was in that proposal? What was sort of the broad consensus that proposal reflected? First of all, it had proposals that had to do with what we do with current residents, that we have approximately 11 million people who have come under this broken system. What do we do with them? So this legislation would have set up a category called registered provisional immigrant, only for people that have come during previous systems. So it wouldn't continue. It wouldn't be for anybody else past that. It would just sort of do a reset. Anybody who fit into this category had to have no significant criminal record, had to pay back taxes, needed to demonstrate English capacity and civic knowledge. They would be, there was a relatively, I think it was 13 years before they could potentially become a permanent resident. So this would be a temporary category, but it would be a temporary category for multiple years. When it came time for them to apply for residency, if they were eligible, they would be last in line. So they would take care of everybody else who had been in line waiting before they would take care of these folks. There would also need to be proof that there was a 90% reduction in illegal entries in key areas of the border in order for anybody under this category to get permanent residency. And permanent residency would come before citizenship. So they wouldn't get citizenship, they would get permanent residency after 13 years, and then they could potentially get citizenship. There were some categories that were prioritized that were able to move more quickly. They prioritized dreamers, people who were brought here as small children. They prioritized agricultural workers. There was funding in the proposal to end the backlog. As you know, there's a many-year backlog of people who are eligible and qualified, but they don't fit under the annual quotas, or we just don't have enough staff allocated. We don't have enough funding for staff allocated for them to be processed. It would include their families if their families were in this country, not if they had to petition to bring their families. It would include deportees, people who have already been deported that had no criminal record and had spouses or children who were documented, meaning that they were permanent residents or citizens. People in this registered provisional immigrant category would have no access to federal benefits of any kind. So that's the first set of provisions in the legislative proposal. The second set of provisions had to do with the changes in the existing system. So the system would move from the system we have now to the kind of system that exists in Canada and in the UK. It would be a point system. The difference between our point system and the point systems in Canada and the UK is that we would allocate points a little differently so that we would continue to maintain our commitment to family unity, for example, by the points that we gave for a family relationship. We would give points for family, we would give points for work history, we would give points for professional skills, and we would give points for contributions to this country. So people who had done, wonderful things of one kind or another, either service or inventions or something that we really wanted to recognize the merit of, they would have a category as well, that they would fit into this. There would also be prioritization given to foreign students in United States universities who were foreign students who had gotten a graduate degree in a STEM field. There would be a prioritization of religious workers. There is a religious worker category, but it would be made easier and more generous. There was a category for entrepreneurs that we wanted to reward people who could demonstrate that they were able to start a small business. And I don't know exactly how they would determine that they were able to succeed at it, but there were some tests that were used to determine that. Agricultural workers, technological assessment of employment needs. We would use technology to determine every year what our employment needs for immigrants actually were as a country, and we would allocate visas correspondingly. There was also a temporary category for low-wage workers, a guest worker program. We would get rid of all country quotas. So we really wouldn't care what country people came from anymore, just how many points they had. We would also repeal the diversity visas, the visas that currently allow people to apply to come from, it's the diversity lottery, right? They can apply to come from anywhere in the world if less than 50,000 people have come the year before from that country, and they have to have a high school diploma. That category would be erased. There would also be no sibling petitions for citizens. So we would cut out the category of sibling petitions. So you could petition for your parents if you're over 21, you could petition for your children, you could petition for your spouse, but no siblings. There would be increased fees, significantly increased fees, but there would also be support, potential grants for nonprofits to assist people to help to find the funding for those fees. There would also be in response to the concern about immigrants potentially taking American jobs from low-wage workers, there would be a youth jobs program set up for U.S. citizens. So now I'm going to talk about enforcement, because this proposal was focused on enforcement as a key category. So there would be an additional fencing or additional wall only at key crossings. So the proposal did not believe that a wall would stop people from coming. It believed that a wall at key crossings would slow people down, allowing the other kinds of enforcement that the bill would mandate to take effect, or to be used more easily, or to be more cost effective. So the fencing was not seen as a goal in itself, but rather as part of a larger enforcement provision. And so it's fencing only in areas where there had been 30,000 crossings the year before. There would also be 40,000 new Border Patrol officers. There would be smart enforcement, not just a wall, which is a medieval means of enforcement. There would be technological surveillance equipment for the whole length of the border. There would be E-Verify for employers in the United States. So there would be a way of making sure that people could not easily get and maintain work if they were undocumented. One of my absolute favorite provisions in the bill was a provision increasing judicial discretion. So if you had a special case, a case that was humanitarian, a case that was of somebody that you really felt should be in this country by all rights, that a judge could determine that. A judge would have the freedom to determine that. Lastly, in terms of enforcement, there had to be documentation of enforcement effectiveness before people in the RPI category could become permanent residents. There would have to be a 90% reduction in apprehensions in the key areas where there had been 30,000 people or more who had crossed before. So that's what a bill looks like that has broad bipartisan agreement. This bill received very high support when people were polled about the bill, that the support was 75%, I think. So this is what an immigration policy could look like that in many ways would be more effective, logical, fair, and humane than our current policy. But it's up to you to decide, what provisions of this policy you think make sense, what doesn't make sense, what other policy you would recommend, and how you would see that all of that, not only in terms of what you think makes sense to you, but particularly what you think is spiritually faithful and theologically sound. Thank you.